Our first step to creating an HDR image is to secure a range of component images that have either been shot at different f-stops, so you could have 3, 5, 7 such exposures that were done on multiple f-stops, or you can use a single image to which you create the f-stops digitally. Now, I tend to use the second method just because I don't have to deal with ghosting and movement, and it works really well in general for me. A lot of purists shudder at this, but hey, everyone's entitled to opinion. Anyhow, without further ado, let's go ahead and open up the raw file in Photoshop. Raw files in Photoshop are treated a little bit differently from JPEGs. They won't just directly open up in the Photoshop interface, they'll actually open up in a raw converter interface. Now, I shoot with a Canon 1000D, and hence my files are all CR2s. If you're shooting with a Nikon or a different make of camera, you probably get a different file. Doesn't matter. The important thing is that you know what your raw file looks like. Now, the thing to note on the raw viewer is the histogram and this slider for exposure, because these are going to be your key guides. The histogram shows you what the intensity of the light frequencies for all the different colors, your blues, cyans, your reds, yellows, greens, and your whites, what their intensities are at a given exposure. Now, to get a good HDR, you want to make sure that you've got a good distribution of frequencies all the way from the left, where you've got your blues and your indigos, all the way to your rights, where you've got your reds. And typically, if you slit this all the way from one side to the other, you would see they would peak on one side when I go down to about -4, and then they would peak on the other side on this particular image probably at about, I would say, there at 2, and you see that my image is completely blown out and it's overexposed. So, first order of business is to create component images. Given that I've got a range of -4 to 2, that's 6 EVs, I've decided that I'm going to go at distances of 0.67 or 2/3 of an EV from each component image. So to start that process, using the exposure dialog, it's just a matter of toggling that down and saving each component image with a functional name. So let's go ahead and create these. It's important that you maintain the same spacing among all the component images. You could choose to do them at larger or smaller intervals. It doesn't really matter. A lot of this is really trial and error until you figure out what works best. But the thing to bear in mind is that the smaller the separation, the higher the number of files you'll have, and the higher number of files that you have, the more powerful a machine you're going to need to run Photomatix to generate an HDR. So you've got to make that call. I run a fairly beefy machine. I'm running this off a laptop right now, and this laptop has got 3 GB of RAM. My desktop runs on 8 GB of memory, so it's really a question of what do you have at your disposal. The other thing is that having multiple exposures that are very, very close to one another doesn't really add any value, because you're more or less going to have the same set of frequencies. Hence, you've got to make a judgment call about what your separation is going to be among your components. So anyhow, here we are, creating our set of components. I've just gone past 0, which was my correctly exposed image, and I've gone ahead, created the +67, the +1.33, and finally the +2 EV spaced image. So there we are, our entire set of images all saved up together in a single location. Now when you're done with this, a couple of things to remember. Make sure that you set this back to 0.00 and do not hit the done button, but actually hit the cancel button. This ensures the integrity of your original raw file so that you don't go ahead and overwrite it, because odds are that you will probably come back and do this a couple of different times before getting the right effect. Anyhow, that's the end of the first step. We have just created a set of multiple component images, which will go and feed into Photomatix in our next step. I hope this was useful. We'll get to you in the next set of the tutorials. Catch you soon. Before we finish up this section, let's look at the images we've just created. I've set this sequence of images up to where we vary through one set of exposures to the other. albeit very gently through a transition one by one. If you pay close attention, you'll see how each set of exposures become more or less apparent for highlights and shadows as you work your way through. This and more tutorials on www.doubleconvex.com. See you there.